The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as Thomas Parker checked the address on his phone one more time. The Victorian house loomed before him, its faded blue paint and ornate trim speaking of better days gone by. At 32, Thomas had worked as a home care aide for nearly 5 years, but something about this particular assignment made him uneasy. Number 47 Maple Street, he muttered to himself, adjusting the strap of his bag. His supervisor's words from yesterday still rang in his ears. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield is particular, she had said, her expression carefully neutral. We've had 3 aides quit in the past 2 months. But you're good with the tough ones, Thomas. 3 visits a week, basic care and companionship. That's all she needs. Thomas sighed and walked up the stone path to the front door. Dried leaves crunched beneath his feet, evidence that no one had swept here in some time. The brass knocker felt cold under his hand as he rapped 3 times. The wait stretched uncomfortably long. Thomas was about to knock again when he heard the slow tap of a cane against hardwood floors. The door creaked open to reveal a thin woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite her age, his paperwork said 87, she stood remarkably straight, only slightly leaning on her wooden cane. Her piercing blue eyes assessed him with undisguised skepticism. Mrs. Whitfield? Thomas smiled warmly. I'm Thomas Parker from Helping Hands Home Care. I believe they called to let you know I'd be starting today? The old woman didn't return his smile. You're late. Thomas checked his watch. I'm actually 5 minutes early, ma'am. Early is on time is late. She turned without waiting for a response and walked into the house, her cane tapping a steady rhythm. Close the door behind you. The draft is terrible for my joints. Thomas followed her inside, taking in the interior of the house. Unlike the somewhat neglected exterior, the inside was immaculately clean. Antique furniture gleamed with polish, and not a speck of dust could be seen on any surface. Family photographs in silver frames lined the walls, showcasing what appeared to be decades of memories. I've made a list, Mrs. Whitfield said, gesturing to a notepad on a small table in the entryway. These are the tasks I expect completed today. Your agency says you're here for 4 hours. That should be more than sufficient. Thomas picked up the list and scanned it. Medication organization, light dusting, preparing lunch, accompanying her on a short walk if weather permits. Standard tasks, nothing unusual. This looks manageable, he said. Is there anything else you'd like me to know about your routine or preferences? Mrs. Whitfield regarded him with cool detachment. I prefer silence when possible. I find excessive chatter exhausting. The kitchen is through there, she pointed with her cane. Bathroom is down the hall. My bedroom is upstairs, but you won't need to go there. I can manage the stairs just fine. I understand. I'll try not to disturb your peace, Thomas replied, keeping his tone professional despite the chilly reception. Good. She nodded curtly. I'll be in the sitting room with my book. You may find me when lunch is ready. With that, she turned and made her way toward what Thomas assumed was the sitting room. Leaving him alone in the entryway, well, this is going to be fun, he whispered to himself, then set about exploring the kitchen to familiarize himself with the layout. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, was a blend of vintage charm and practical updates. An old-fashioned stove stood beside a modern refrigerator. Copper pots hung from a rack and well-used cookbooks lined a small shelf. Thomas opened the refrigerator and found it well-stocked with fresh vegetables, dairy products, and containers of what appeared to be home-cooked meals. He decided to start with organizing Mrs. Whitfield's medications. Her pill organizer sat on the counter next to several prescription bottles. Thomas worked methodically, checking each medication against the list provided by his agency, sorting morning and evening doses. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how quiet the house was. No television or radio played in the background. No clock ticked on the wall. The silence felt heavy, almost like another presence in the room. After finishing with the medications, Thomas moved on to preparing lunch. The list specified soup and a sandwich, so he found a container of homemade tomato soup in the refrigerator and heated it slowly on the stove. He assembled a simple cheese sandwich with the fresh bread he found in the bread box. Just as he was ladling the soup into a bowl, he heard a soft melody drift through the house. The notes were so faint at first that he wasn't sure if he was imagining them. He paused, holding his breath to listen. It was definitely piano music, but it seemed to be coming from a recording rather than someone playing. Thomas placed the soup bowl on a tray alongside the sandwich and followed the sound down a hallway he hadn't explored yet. The hallway opened into a sunroom at the back of the house. Large windows let in streams of natural light, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. And there, in the corner of the room, partially covered by a white sheet, stood a grand piano. The music wasn't coming from the piano itself, but from a small record player on a side table. Thomas stepped into the room, drawn by the beauty of the melody. The record played a classical piece he couldn't name, but the emotion in the performance was unmistakable. So entranced was he by the music that he didn't notice Mrs. Whitfield watching him from the doorway until she spoke. "That will be all, Mr. Parker." Thomas startled, nearly spilling the soup. "I'm sorry. I was just bringing your lunch and heard the music. I prefer to eat in the dining room." Her voice was tight, and Thomas noticed her knuckles had gone white where she gripped her cane. "And I'd appreciate if you didn't wander through my house uninvited." "Of course." "I apologize," Thomas said, backing out of the room. He couldn't help but glance once more at the piano, wondering why such a beautiful instrument was kept covered and apparently unused. Lunch was a silent affair. Mrs. Whitfield ate slowly, her movements precise and deliberate. Thomas busied himself with the light dusting mentioned on the list, making sure to stay within her sight as he worked around the dining room. "Have you been playing piano long?" he asked, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Mrs. Whitfield's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "I don't recall asking for conversation, Mr. Parker. You're right. I'm sorry." Thomas returned to his dusting, mentally kicking himself for pushing. After a moment of silence, Mrs. Whitfield surprised him by answering, "I don't play anymore." "Not for many years now." Thomas nodded but didn't press further. He continued working quietly, occasionally stealing glances at the elderly woman. Despite her harsh demeanor, there was something compelling about her. A sadness that seemed to hover around her like a shadow. After lunch, Thomas cleaned up while Mrs. Whitfield returned to the sitting room with her book. The weather had turned drizzly, eliminating the possibility of a walk. With most of his tasks completed and still an hour left in his shift, Thomas found himself at loose ends. He returned to the kitchen and noticed a stack of photo albums on a high shelf. Remembering Mrs. Whitfield's earlier comment about excessive chatter being exhausting, he wondered if looking through photos together might be a quieter way to connect. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, standing in the doorway of the sitting room, "I noticed you have some photo albums in the kitchen. Would you like me to bring one down for us to look through together?" She looked up from her book, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Thomas thought she might refuse. Then she closed her book and placed it on the side table. "The blue album on the far left," she said. "Bring that one." Thomas retrieved the album and sat in the armchair across from her. He handed her the heavy book, which she accepted with surprising gentleness. "My husband Richard took most of these," she said, opening to the first page. He always had a camera in his hand. The photographs inside were black and white, showing a much younger Mrs. Whitfield. In many of them, she was seated at a piano, not the one in the sunroom, but what appeared to be different pianos in various settings. "Concert halls, studios, elegant homes. You performed?" Thomas asked softly. Mrs. Whitfield nodded, her finger tracing the outline of one photograph. "For many years." As she turned the pages, Thomas caught glimpses of a life far removed from the quiet, isolated existence Mrs. Whitfield now led. There were photos of her with well-dressed people at glamorous events, newspaper clippings with headlines praising performances, and intimate shots of her practicing at home. Lost in the music. "You must have been quite accomplished," Thomas said. "I was adequate," she replied, but there was a hint of pride in her voice that contradicted her modest words. They sat in companionable silence as she continued turning pages. Thomas noticed that the later photos showed fewer performances and more domestic scenes. Eventually, the piano disappeared from the images altogether. When they reached the end of the album, Mrs. Whitfield closed it with a sense of finality. "That's enough for today." Thomas glanced at his watch. "I should be going soon anyway. Is there anything else you need before I leave?" "No." She handed him the album. "Same time on Wednesday, then?" "Yes, ma'am. I'll be here." Thomas returned the album to its place in the kitchen, gathered his things, and headed for the door. As he was about to leave, he hesitated. "Mrs. Whitfield, I enjoyed seeing your photographs. Thank you for sharing them with me." She stood in the hallway, leaning on her cane, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Good day, Mr. Parker." As Thomas walked down the stone path, he couldn't shake the image of the covered piano in the sunroom. There was a story there, a story of music and silence, of a passion abandoned. And despite her cool demeanor, Thomas found himself genuinely curious about Eleanor Whitfield and the life she had led before she became the solitary woman in the fading Victorian house. He had a feeling there was much more to discover in the coming visits, if only she would let him in. Thomas arrived for his third visit to Mrs. Whitfield's house with a small brown paper bag in hand. The past week had been filled with the same polite but distant interactions. Eleanor, as he'd begun to think of her, though he still addressed her formally, had maintained her cool demeanor, speaking only when necessary and keeping conversation brief. But Thomas had noticed things. The way her eyes lingered on the hallway leading to the sunroom. How she sometimes tilted her head slightly when distant piano music drifted from a neighbor's open window. Small signs that despite her silence on the matter, music still moved something deep within her. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield," he called as he let himself in with the key she'd reluctantly provided after making him wait in the rain during his last visit. "In the kitchen," came her reply. Thomas found her seated at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling before her, a newspaper spread open. She looked tired today with dark circles under her eyes. "Did you have trouble sleeping?" he asked, setting down his bag and hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. Eleanor folded the newspaper precisely. "I always have trouble sleeping, Mr. Parker. It comes with age." "I brought you something," Thomas said, retrieving the paper bag. "Fresh scones from the bakery on Elm Street. The owner said they're your favorite, lemon with poppy seeds." Surprise flickered across Eleanor's face. "You spoke to Henry?" "I stop there for coffee sometimes," Thomas explained. "When I mentioned I was working with you, he immediately started telling me how you used to come in every Sunday after church." He placed the bag on the table. "He said he hasn't seen you in almost a year." Eleanor's fingers brushed against the paper bag but didn't open it. "I don't go out much anymore. Maybe we could walk there next week if the weather's nice. It's not far." "Perhaps." Her non-committal response was still more encouraging than her usual dismissals. Thomas consulted the list she'd left for him today. Water the plants, change the bed sheets, prepare a vegetable stew for her to have over the next few days. Standard tasks that would keep him busy but weren't particularly challenging. "I'll start with the plants," he said cheerfully. "Is it still just the ones in the living room and dining room?" Eleanor nodded. "And don't overwater the ferns this time. They're still recovering." Thomas bit back a smile. Her sharp observation of everything he did wrong was oddly comforting. At least she was paying attention. He worked steadily through the morning, moving from task to task. Eleanor remained mostly in the kitchen, occasionally moving to the sitting room with her book. Around noon, she announced that she needed to rest and would be taking a nap. "I'll be quiet," Thomas promised. "I'll just finish up the stew and let it simmer." Eleanor nodded and made her way upstairs, her cane tapping rhythmically against the wooden steps. Thomas listened until he heard the soft click of her bedroom door closing. The vegetables were already chopped, the broth prepared. He set everything to simmer on low heat, then found himself with nearly an hour of downtime while Eleanor napped and the stew cooked. The house felt different without her watchful presence, more relaxed somehow. Almost without conscious decision, Thomas found himself walking toward the sunroom. The covered piano had lingered in his thoughts since his first visit. He stepped quietly into the sun-drenched room, noting how dust particles danced in the beams of light streaming through the windows. The piano stood exactly as before, its bulk hidden beneath the white sheet. Thomas approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Standing before it, he hesitated only briefly before gently lifting one corner of the sheet. The dark, polished wood beneath gleamed, clearly well-maintained despite being covered. Encouraged, Thomas carefully pulled the sheet away, folding it neatly and placing it on a nearby chair. The revealed piano was breathtaking, a Steinway grand in perfect condition. Not a speck of dust marred its gleaming surface. Thomas ran his fingers lightly along the edge, marveling at how something so beautiful could be hidden away. He lifted the fallboard that covered the keys, revealing pristine ivory and ebony. Though he couldn't play himself, his musical education consisted of 3 painful months of recorder. In 4th grade, he was drawn to touch just one key, His finger pressed down gently on a white key somewhere in the middle. The clear, resonant note hung in the air, surprisingly loud in the quiet house. Thomas froze, listening for any sound of movement upstairs. When no disturbance came, he pressed another key, then another, fascinated by the different tones. He had just pressed a fourth key when a voice spoke from the doorway. Bach would be horrified by that combination of notes. Thomas spun around to find Eleanor standing there, leaning heavily on her cane. Instead of anger, her expression held a complex mixture of emotions Thomas couldn't quite interpret. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have uncovered it without asking." Eleanor moved slowly into the room, her eyes fixed on the piano. "No, you shouldn't have." Thomas hastily lowered the fallboard. "I'll cover it again. I was just curious." "Curious," Eleanor repeated softly. She approached the piano, running her hand along its side in a gesture that seemed almost like a caress. "Do you play, Mr. Parker?" "No," Thomas admitted. "I've always wished I could, but never learned." Eleanor nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "It takes discipline, years of practice, talent too, though some will tell you differently." She lowered herself onto the bench with a grace that belied her age, her cane hooked over the edge. For a moment, Thomas thought she might play, but instead she simply sat there, her hands resting in her lap. "My husband had this delivered for our 10th anniversary, she said, her voice distant with memory. "It cost more than our first house." Thomas remained silent, afraid that any response might break whatever spell had prompted this sudden openness. "He used to sit right where you're standing, for hours while I practiced." A faint smile touched her lips. "He never complained, not once, even when I played the same passage 50 times in a row." "He must have loved hearing you play," Thomas ventured. "He did." The simple acknowledgement seemed to drain something from her. Eleanor stood abruptly. "Cover it again, please, and don't uncover it again without permission." "Of course. I'm sorry." As Thomas carefully replaced the sheet, Eleanor lingered by the door watching. "The stew is probably ready to be stirred," she said finally. "Right away, Mrs. Whitfield." She turned to leave but paused. "You asked last time about the photographs. There are more albums if you're interested." Thomas looked up, surprised by the offer. "I'd like that very much." Eleanor nodded and left the room. Thomas followed shortly after, returning to the kitchen where the stew bubbled gently on the stove. As he stirred, he wondered about the significance of what had just happened, not just the discovery of the piano, but Eleanor's reaction to it after lunch. Eleanor directed Thomas to a cabinet in the sitting room. "The albums are on the bottom shelf." Thomas knelt and found 5 leather-bound photo albums, each one labeled with dates spanning several decades. He selected one from the middle and brought it to where Eleanor sat in her armchair. "May I?" he asked, indicating the sofa across from her. "Please." She gestured for him to sit. This album was different from the one they'd looked at during his first visit. While that one had contained mostly formal performance photos, this one seemed more personal. Candid shots of Eleanor at home, at various social gatherings, and yes, often at the piano. "Who took these?" Thomas asked, noting the intimate quality of many images. "Richard, my husband. He always had a camera in hand." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Turn to page 12. There's one there I think you'll find interesting." Thomas did as instructed and found himself looking at a newspaper clipping, preserved behind a plastic sheet. The headline read, "Whitfield stuns critics with Rachmaninoff performance." "This was you?" he asked, studying the grainy image of a much younger Eleanor taking a bow on what appeared to be a major concert hall stage. "Carnegie Hall, 1962, she confirmed, a hint of pride in her voice. The New York Times called it revelatory. Thomas looked up from the album to the elderly woman before him, seeing her in a new light. "You weren't just someone who played piano. You were a concert pianist. For a time," she acknowledged. "Turn the page." The next page held more reviews, all glowing. Eleanor's name appeared alongside those of famous composers and venerable music halls. Programs from concerts in London, Paris, Vienna. "You were famous," Thomas said softly. "In certain circles." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but her eyes had taken on a shine that Thomas hadn't seen before. It was another life. As they continued through the album, Thomas began to notice a pattern. The concerts became less frequent over the years, the venues smaller. Eventually, the performance photos disappeared entirely, replaced by domestic scenes. What happened? He asked finally. Why did you stop performing? Eleanor closed the album gently. That's enough for today, I think. Thomas nodded, respecting her boundary. He returned the album to its place in the cabinet. Thank you for sharing that with me. You're welcome. Eleanor picked up her book, a clear signal that conversation time was over. As Thomas finished his remaining tasks, his mind kept returning to the covered piano and the newspaper clippings. There was clearly more to Eleanor Whitfield's story than met the eye. A life of music and acclaim that had somehow led to this quiet, isolated existence. When it was time for him to leave, Eleanor was dozing in her chair. Rather than wake her, Thomas left a note beside her teacup. Stew is in the refrigerator. See you on Friday. Thomas. As he quietly closed the front door behind him, Thomas found himself unexpectedly looking forward to his next visit. For the first time since beginning this assignment, he felt he'd glimpsed the real person behind Mrs. Whitfield's stern facade, a woman with a past, full of passion and accomplishment, and he couldn't help but wonder what had caused her to turn away from the music that had once defined her life. Over the next few weeks, a cautious routine developed between Thomas and Eleanor. 3 times a week he would arrive at her Victorian home, complete the tasks on her meticulously written lists, and they would share lunch together. Sometimes, if Eleanor was in a particularly good mood, they would look through more photo albums afterward. Thomas had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated Eleanor's state of mind. If the classical music record player was on when he arrived, it usually meant she was feeling nostalgic and more willing to talk. If her bedroom door remained closed until late morning, it signaled a poor night's sleep and a day when silence was preferred. Today, as Thomas let himself in with his key, he noticed immediately that something was different. The house was filled with the scent of baking, cinnamon and apples, and Mozart played softly from the record player in the sitting room. Mrs. Whitfield? He called, hanging up his jacket. In the kitchen, came her reply, and Thomas was surprised to hear a lightness in her voice that was rarely present. He found Eleanor seated at the kitchen table, a cup of tea before her and a freshly baked apple cake cooling on a rack by the window. You've been busy this morning, Thomas said, smiling at the unexpected sight. Eleanor shrugged, but there was a hint of pride in her expression. I woke early and felt like baking. It's been years, but apparently some skills don't fade. It smells wonderful. Thomas washed his hands at the sink. What's on the list for today? Eleanor gestured to the usual notepad, but when Thomas picked it up, he found only 2 items: dust bookshelves and walk to park, weather permitting. A light day? He asked, surprised. The weather forecast promised sunshine, and it's been too long since I've been to the park. Eleanor took a sip of her tea. Besides, I thought you might enjoy some cake for your efforts these past weeks. Thomas was touched by the gesture. Thank you. That's very kind. Don't get sentimental, Mr. Parker. It's just cake. But the usual bite was missing from her words. After dusting the bookshelves, a task that took less than an hour, Thomas found Eleanor in the sitting room, dressed for outdoors in a wool coat and hat that must have been fashionable decades ago, but somehow still suited her perfectly. Ready for our walk? He asked. Eleanor nodded, reaching for her cane. The park is only 3 blocks, but we'll take it slowly. The October day was indeed beautiful, crisp and clear, with leaves in fiery shades of red and gold drifting from the trees that lined the street. Thomas matched his pace to Eleanor's, noticing how she held herself straight despite her slow, careful steps. I used to walk to this park every morning, Eleanor said as they made their way down the sidewalk. Richard and I both did, rain or shine. After he passed, I kept it up for a while, but then she trailed off with a small shrug. It's hard to maintain routines when you're grieving, Thomas said gently. Eleanor glanced at him. You sound like you speak from experience, Thomas nodded. My father died when I was 25. For months afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go fishing, something we'd done together every weekend since I was a boy. And now I go whenever I can. It feels like a way to keep him with me. They walked in companionable silence for a while. As they entered the park, Eleanor directed them to a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks swam lazily across the surface. Richard proposed to me on this bench, she said once they were seated. 62 years ago this month, Thomas smiled at the image. He had good taste in locations. He did. Eleanor watched the ducks, her expression softening with memory. We were so young. I was just starting to gain recognition for my playing. He was finishing his degree in architecture. How did you meet? Thomas asked, realizing he'd never heard this part of her story. At a university concert. I was performing Chopin and he was in the audience. A smile touched her lips. He sent me a note afterward comparing my playing to sunshine breaking through clouds. Terribly poetic, but it worked. Thomas laughed. Clearly, they sat in silence for a while, enjoying the peaceful scene and the occasional sounds of children playing in a distant part of the park. Richard always supported my career, Eleanor said suddenly. Even when it meant I was traveling for months at a time. He never complained, never made me feel guilty for pursuing my passion. Thomas nodded, sensing she needed to talk. He was the one who pushed me to keep playing, even after. She stopped, her hands tightening on her cane. After what? Thomas asked softly. Eleanor shook her head. It doesn't matter now. Ancient history. She straightened her shoulders. We should head back. I'm getting cold. Thomas knew better than to push. He stood and offered his arm for support, which Eleanor accepted with only a moment's hesitation. The walk back was slower, Eleanor's energy clearly flagging. By the time they reached the house, she was leaning heavily on both Thomas and her cane. Why don't you rest while I make some tea? Thomas suggested as he helped her to her armchair. And maybe we can try a slice of that cake. Eleanor nodded, looking tired but somehow more at peace than Thomas had ever seen her. There's a tin of Earl Grey in the cabinet above the stove, Richard's favorite. Thomas busied himself in the kitchen, setting the kettle to boil and carefully cutting 2 slices of the apple cake. He arranged everything on a tray and carried it to the sitting room, only to find Eleanor dozing in her chair. Her head tilted slightly to one side, not wanting to disturb her. Thomas set the tray down quietly and was about to retreat when his gaze fell on a framed photograph he hadn't noticed before. It sat on a small table beside Eleanor's chair, a black and white image of a younger Eleanor at the piano, her face alight with joy as she played, Richard standing beside her with unmistakable pride and love in his expression. Thomas studied the photograph, struck by how different Eleanor looked, not just younger, but vibrant, alive with passion for her music. What had happened to extinguish that light? The record player had stopped, and in the silence Thomas became aware of a soft murmuring. Eleanor was talking in her sleep, her expression troubled. Not worth it anymore, she mumbled. After what they wrote? Thomas hesitated, feeling like an intruder on a private moment, but concerned by her obvious distress. Gently, he touched her shoulder. Mrs. Whitfield, Eleanor, your tea is ready. Eleanor's eyes opened, momentarily confused before focusing on Thomas. I must have dozed off. Just for a few minutes, he assured her, handing her the teacup. I cut us each a slice of cake. It looks delicious. Eleanor accepted the tea but waved away the cake. Perhaps later. I find I'm not very hungry right now. Thomas sat across from her with his own tea, debating whether to mention what he'd overheard. Finally, his curiosity won out. You were talking in your sleep, he said carefully. Something about what they wrote. Were you dreaming about your music career? Eleanor's hand stilled her teacup halfway to her lips. For a moment, Thomas thought she might refuse to answer or even scold him for prying. But after a long pause, she sighed. I suppose there's no harm in telling you. It's hardly a secret, just ancient history now. She set her teacup down. Have you ever had your life's work, your deepest passion, torn apart in public? Thomas shook his head. I played at Lincoln Center in 1975. A major performance, Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. I'd been practicing for months. Eleanor's gaze grew distant. The audience gave a standing ovation. I thought it had gone well. She reached for her tea again, her hand not quite steady. The next morning, the New York Times published a review. The critic, a man named Harrison Powell, wrote that my playing was technically proficient but soulless, that I had the precision of a machine but none of the heart that separates true artists from mere performers. Thomas winced. That's harsh. It was devastating, Eleanor corrected. Powell was influential. After his review, other critics began to focus on the same perceived flaw in my playing. Mechanical. Cold. Precise but passionless. Her voice had taken on a bitter edge. Suddenly, the very technique I had spent decades perfecting was being used against me. But surely not everyone agreed with him. No, not everyone. But enough. Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her teacup. Attendance at my concerts began to decline. Invitations to perform came less frequently. Richard kept telling me it would pass, that critics are fickle, but... You lost confidence, Thomas said softly. Eleanor looked up, her eyes sharp. I lost my joy, Mr. Parker. Every time I sat at the piano, I heard Powell's words. I began to second-guess every interpretation, every phrase. And when you do that, when you're thinking instead of feeling, the music dies. Thomas nodded, understanding now why the piano remained covered, why Eleanor had turned away from what had once been the center of her life. What did Richard say? He asked. A sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. He never gave up trying to get me to play again. Even in his final years, when he was ill, he would ask me to play for him. Just one piece, he'd say. Just for him. She looked away. I couldn't do it. And now he's gone. And I've lost both my music and the only person who truly believed in it. The weight of her regret filled the room. Thomas searched for something to say that wouldn't sound like empty comfort. It's never too late, you know, he said finally. To find joy in it again. Eleanor shook her head. Some bells can't be unrung, Mr. Parker. Some chances don't come twice. She straightened in her chair, visibly collecting herself. Now, I believe you were going to try my cake. Tell me honestly what you think. My taste buds aren't what they used to be. Thomas recognized the deliberate change of subject and respected it. As they ate their cake and spoke of lighter matters, he couldn't help but glance occasionally at the hallway leading to the sunroom, where the piano sat waiting beneath its sheet, silent but not forgotten. Later, as he prepared to leave, Eleanor handed him a small parcel wrapped in wax paper. A slice of cake for later, she explained. Consider it a thank you for the walk today. Thomas accepted it with a smile. Thank you. I enjoyed our outing, as did I. Eleanor hesitated, then added, perhaps we could make it a regular occurrence. Weather permitting, I'd like that very much. As Thomas walked to his car, he found himself thinking about Eleanor's story, about passion lost and regrets carried for decades. He wondered if there was a way to help her find her way back to the music that had once brought her such joy. The answer, he suspected, might lie beneath a white sheet in a sunlit room, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. 2 months had passed since Thomas first walked up the cracked sidewalk to Eleanor's Victorian home. The crisp days of October had given way to November's chill, and now December had arrived, bringing with it early darkness and the first dusting of snow. Thomas had grown fond of his thrice-weekly visits. Eleanor had softened considerably toward him, though she still maintained certain boundaries. Their park walks had become a regular occurrence until the weather turned too cold. Now they spent that time in the sitting room instead, Thomas reading aloud from novels Eleanor selected from her extensive library. Today, however, was different. When Thomas arrived, the house was dark and quiet. No record playing, no smell of tea brewing. He called out as usual but received no response. Mrs. Whitfield? He moved through the hallway, concern growing. Eleanor? A faint sound from upstairs drew his attention. Thomas hesitated. Eleanor had always been clear that the upstairs was her private domain, but worry overcame his reluctance. He climbed the stairs slowly, calling her name again. In here, came a weak reply from the room at the end of the hall. Thomas found Eleanor sitting on the edge of her bed, still in her nightgown despite the late morning hour. Her face was pale, her silver hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual neat bun. I'm afraid I'm not well today, she said, her voice strained. Perhaps you should come back tomorrow. Thomas approached carefully. What's wrong? Have you called your doctor? Eleanor shook her head. It's nothing serious, just a touch of dizziness when I tried to get dressed. She attempted a dismissive wave that didn't quite mask her discomfort. It happens occasionally. When was the last time you ate something? Thomas asked, noticing a glass of water on her bedside table but no sign of food. Eleanor frowned. Yesterday. Lunchtime, I think. That's nearly 24 hours ago. Thomas made a quick decision. I'm going to help you back into bed and then I'll bring you something to eat. After that, we can decide if the doctor needs to be called. To his surprise, Eleanor didn't argue. She allowed him to help her lie back against her pillows, a concession that told Thomas more about how poorly she felt than any words could have. The bedroom, like the rest of the house, was a testament to a life long shared and then suddenly lived alone. A man's robe still hung on a hook by the door. 2 reading lamps flanked the bed, though only one nightstand showed signs of use. On the wall hung a large photograph of Eleanor and Richard on what appeared to be their wedding day, both looking impossibly young and happy. "I'll be right back," Thomas promised. Heading downstairs to the kitchen, he quickly prepared a tray with toast, scrambled eggs, and tea, adding a small vase with a sprig of evergreen he cut from the bush by the front door, a touch of color in the winter gloom. When he returned upstairs, Eleanor had closed her eyes, but she opened them as he entered. "You didn't need to go to so much trouble," she said, but her expression softened at the sight of the greenery. "It's no trouble," Thomas assured her, setting the tray across her lap. "Small meals are better when you're not feeling well. Try to eat a little." Eleanor managed a few bites of toast and most of the eggs. The food brought some color back to her cheeks, but Thomas remained concerned by her unusual fragility. "Today is December 5th, isn't it?" she asked suddenly. Thomas nodded. "Yes, it is." Eleanor's gaze drifted to the wedding photograph. "It would have been our anniversary. 58 years. Her voice was steady, but Thomas saw the grief in her eyes, fresh and raw despite the years since Richard's passing. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly. "Those milestone days are always difficult." Eleanor looked at him with surprise, as if she'd forgotten he was there. "Yes, they are." She pushed the tray away gently. "Thank you for breakfast, but I think I'd like to rest now." "Of course." Thomas took the tray. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything. Should I call someone to stay with you tonight? A friend or relative?" A bitter smile touched Eleanor's lips. "There's no one to call, Mr. Parker. Most of my friends are gone now, and we never had children." The simple statement, delivered matter-of-factly, struck Thomas as unbearably sad. He couldn't imagine facing grief so utterly alone. "I could stay a bit later today," he offered. "Make sure you're feeling better before I leave." Eleanor looked as if she might refuse, but then nodded slightly. "If you don't mind." Thomas spent the morning quietly completing his usual tasks, checking on Eleanor periodically. By early afternoon, she had dressed and made her way downstairs, moving slowly but insisting on walking without help. "I'm not an invalid," she said when Thomas tried to offer his arm. "Just an old woman having a difficult day." She settled in her armchair in the sitting room, wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the warmth from the heating vents. Thomas brought her tea and then continued dusting the bookshelves, keeping a watchful eye on her. Eleanor sat silently, her gaze distant, the book in her lap unopened. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. Outside, the early winter darkness was already gathering, gray clouds promising more snow. The house felt heavy with silence and memory. "He loved this time of year," Eleanor said suddenly. "Richard, I mean. Christmas was his favorite holiday. He'd spend weeks finding the perfect gifts." She smiled faintly. "One year he gave me a first edition of Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I never did find out how he afforded it on an architect's salary." Thomas set down his dusting cloth and sat in the chair opposite her. "He sounds like a thoughtful man." He was. Eleanor's fingers traced the pattern on her teacup. "For our 25th anniversary, he arranged a private concert for me, hired a quartet to play in our living room because I was too busy with my own performances to attend concerts as an audience member." Her voice caught. "And for our 50th, even though he was already ill, he had a star named after me. So you'll always have music in the heavens," he said. Thomas listened quietly, sensing she needed to speak about Richard today, to keep his memory present on their anniversary. "The last gift he ever gave me was a recording," Eleanor continued, "a young pianist playing Debussy. Listen," he told me. "She plays with her heart just like you used to." A tear slipped down her cheek, which she quickly brushed away. "He never stopped believing I would return to it someday." "The piano," Thomas said softly. Eleanor nodded. "I haven't played since before his diagnosis." 5 years of silence. She looked toward the hallway that led to the sunroom. "Sometimes I think I can hear it calling me, like a voice just beyond hearing." "Ridiculous, isn't it?" "Not at all," Thomas said. "Music was your life's passion. That doesn't just disappear." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a decision that seemed to surprise even her, she set down her teacup and struggled to her feet. "Would you help me to the sunroom, please? My balance isn't quite right today." Thomas offered his arm, which she took without her usual reluctance. They walked slowly down the hallway, Eleanor leaning on him more heavily than she would normally allow. The sunroom was cold, having been closed off for weeks as the weather turned. Late afternoon light filtered weakly through the windows, catching dust motes in the air. The piano stood as always, shrouded in its white sheet. Eleanor released Thomas's arm and approached the instrument slowly, her hand outstretched. When she reached it, her fingers hovered over the sheet for a long moment before finally grasping it and pulling it away. The Steinway gleamed in the winter light, dark and imposing and beautiful. Eleanor stood before it, her expression a complex mixture of longing and fear. "Would you play something?" Thomas asked quietly. "Just one piece?" Eleanor shook her head. "I can't, it's been too long and my hands." She held them up, showing the slight tremor that affected her fingers. "Arthritis, age, too many excuses to count." Thomas moved to stand beside her. "Richard would have wanted to hear you play today, wouldn't he?" "On your anniversary?" Eleanor's face crumpled briefly before she regained control. "That's unfair, Mr. Parker." "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged. "But I think it's true." Eleanor touched one key, then another, not pressing hard enough to produce sound, just feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. Then, with a deep breath, she lowered herself onto the bench. "Just one piece," she murmured. Whether to Thomas or to herself, it wasn't clear. "The first one I ever played for him." Thomas stepped back, giving her space. Eleanor sat motionless for what felt like a long time, her hands poised above the keys. Then tentatively she began to play. The first notes were hesitant, uncertain, a simple melody that Thomas didn't recognize but found immediately captivating. Eleanor's hands moved slowly, finding their way across the keyboard as if remembering a path long forgotten. As she continued, her confidence seemed to grow. The hesitation fell away, replaced by a sureness of touch that transformed the music. Thomas watched in awe as Eleanor's entire demeanor changed. Her back straightened, her face softened, and something like joy began to illuminate her features. The piece built gradually, growing more complex, more emotional. Thomas found himself holding his breath, afraid to move lest he break the spell. This was not the frail woman who had needed his help earlier today. This was Eleanor as she must have been decades ago, powerful, passionate, completely immersed in her art. When the final notes faded, silence filled the room once more. Eleanor remained at the piano, her hands now resting in her lap, her eyes closed. "That was beautiful," Thomas said softly. Eleanor opened her eyes, and to his surprise, they were bright with unshed tears. "Debussy," Claire de Lune. Richard always said it reminded him of the night we met. She touched the keys again, gently. "My hands remember more than I thought they would." "Would you play something else?" Thomas asked. Eleanor shook her head, but it wasn't a refusal so much as disbelief. "I never thought I would play again. Not after everything, not after losing him." "He would be proud," Thomas said simply. Eleanor looked up at him, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe he would." She turned back to the piano and began another piece, this one more confident from the start, filled with a warmth and emotion that seemed to fill the cold room. Thomas stood quietly, witnessing something he recognized as profound and deeply personal, a reconnection, a homecoming of sorts. As Eleanor played, the years seemed to fall away from her. The rigid, bitter woman who had first greeted Thomas at her door was gone, replaced by an artist reclaiming a part of herself long surrendered. Outside, snow had begun to fall, large flakes drifting past the windows of the sunroom. Inside, the music flowed like water breaking through a long frozen dam, carrying with it memory and grief and, unexpectedly, joy. Thomas realized he was witnessing a transformation, not just of Eleanor reconnecting with her music, but of a wound finally beginning to heal. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the first crocuses were already pushing through the soil in Eleanor's front garden, and the bare branches of the old maple tree showed hints of green. The Victorian house no longer seemed faded and forbidding to Thomas as he walked up the path. Now it felt like a familiar friend, its quirks and character as known to him as the woman who lived inside. 4 months had passed since the December day when Eleanor had returned to her piano. 4 months of remarkable change. Thomas let himself in with his key, no longer calling out his arrival. The sound of piano music greeted him, not from a record player but live and vibrant. He smiled, hanging up his jacket and following the melody to the sunroom. Eleanor sat at the Steinway, sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating her silver hair. She was playing something complex and beautiful that Thomas didn't recognize. Her fingers moved across the keys with confidence, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The white sheet that had once covered the piano now served as a tablecloth on the small table by the window, where Eleanor took her morning tea while practicing. Thomas waited in the doorway until she finished the piece, not wanting to interrupt. When the final notes faded, he applauded softly. Eleanor turned, a smile lighting her face when she saw him. "You're early today." Traffic was light. Thomas entered the room. "That was beautiful. Chopin?" Eleanor nodded, pleased that he'd recognized the composer. Over the past month, she'd been teaching Thomas about classical music, composers, styles, historical periods. He'd proven an eager student. The Nocturne in E-flat major, she confirmed, one of his most beloved pieces. "It suits you," Thomas said. "Elegant but with hidden depths." Eleanor laughed, a sound that had once been rare but now came easily. "Are you calling me complicated, Mr. Parker?" "In the best possible way," he assured her with a grin. Their relationship had evolved from the formal caregiver-client dynamic into something closer to friendship. Eleanor still had her moments of sharpness, still valued her independence fiercely, but the bitter edge that had defined her when they first met had softened considerably. "There's coffee in the kitchen," Eleanor said, closing the piano lid carefully. "And I've made a list for today, though it's shorter than usual. I thought perhaps we might visit the music store downtown if you're amenable. I've ordered some new sheet music." "Sounds perfect," Thomas agreed, following her to the kitchen. The house itself had transformed along with its owner. Rooms that had once been closed off were now open and aired regularly. Fresh flowers appeared on tables. The photo albums that had been hidden away in cabinets now sat proudly on bookshelves, some open to favorite images. Most significantly, Eleanor had begun teaching piano again. 2 afternoons a week, a young girl from the neighborhood came for lessons. Thomas had arranged it after meeting the child's mother at the grocery store and learning of her daughter's interest in piano, but inability to afford formal lessons. Eleanor had initially resisted the idea. "I haven't taught in 40 years, she'd protested, "and children require patience I no longer possess." But Thomas had persisted, and to everyone's surprise, Eleanor had discovered a talent for teaching she'd never fully explored during her performance career. Young Lily's enthusiasm and natural ability had rekindled something in Eleanor, a desire to share her knowledge, to pass on her passion for music. Over coffee, they reviewed the day's tasks.
Thomas had started taking classes at the local community college 3 evenings a week, working toward a degree in social work, and Eleanor always inquired about his studies. "How was your psychology exam?"
she asked, pouring him a second cup. "I think it went well," Thomas said. "The professor said my essay on grief and healing was particularly insightful." Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken acknowledgement that his experience with her had informed his writing. "You'll make an excellent counselor someday." "I hope so." Thomas had discovered, through his work with Eleanor, a gift for connecting with people in their most difficult moments, a gift he now planned to develop professionally. After breakfast, they worked together on the household tasks. Eleanor was more active now, insisting on doing her share despite Thomas's protests that it was literally his job to help her. "Being old doesn't make me helpless," she reminded him regularly, "and idle hands lead to a stagnant mind." By noon, they were ready for their outing. The music store was a 20-minute drive away, and Eleanor insisted on wearing her good coat and brooch for the occasion. "It's been years since I've visited Herbert's shop," she explained as Thomas helped her into his car. "He probably thinks I've died by now." Thomas laughed. "I'm sure he'll be delighted to see you're very much alive." The drive was pleasant, with Eleanor pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about how the town had changed over the decades. When they arrived at the music store, a narrow shop wedged between a cafe and a bookstore, Thomas noticed Eleanor straighten her shoulders and take a deep breath, as if preparing for an important performance. "Nervous?" he asked gently. Eleanor gave him a sharp look. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm simply aware that this represents another step." Thomas nodded, understanding what she meant. Each return to the world of music was both a victory and a risk, a chance to reclaim joy but also to reawaken old vulnerabilities. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. The shop was smaller than Thomas had expected, crammed with instruments, sheet music, and equipment. A white-haired man looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening in shock. "Eleanor Whitfield? Is that really you?" Eleanor smiled, extending her hand with a grace that spoke of her concert hall days. "Hello, Herbert. It's been too long." The old shopkeeper came around the counter, ignoring her outstretched hand and pulling her into a careful hug instead. 20 years at least. I heard about Richard's passing. I should have reached out, but we all do what we can," Eleanor said simply, patting his arm. "I've come for the Schubert pieces I ordered." Herbert beamed at her. Of course. And who's this young man with you?" "This is Thomas Parker," Eleanor said with a warmth that made Thomas stand a little straighter. "My friend and occasional caregiver, though I require less care these days." "Thanks to you," Thomas added quietly. Herbert looked between them with understanding. "Well, any friend of Eleanor's is welcome here. Let me get those pieces for you." While Herbert disappeared into a back room, Eleanor moved through the shop, running her fingers lightly over instruments, examining new editions of classical works. Thomas watched her, struck by how at home she seemed here, how naturally she had reclaimed this part of her identity. Herbert returned with a folder of sheet music. "I've added a few pieces I thought might interest you," he told Eleanor, "including that arrangement of Gershwin you always admired." As Eleanor examined the music, Herbert turned to Thomas. "She was the finest pianist this town ever produced, you know. When she played Rachmaninoff at Carnegie Hall, critics said—" "Herbert," Eleanor interrupted sharply. "Ancient history isn't relevant to today's purchase." The shopkeeper looked abashed, but Thomas caught his eye with a slight nod that said he already knew and appreciated Eleanor's accomplishments. After completing their purchase, Eleanor surprised both men by asking Herbert if the baby grand in the corner was in tune. "Always," Herbert assured her. "Would you like to try it?" Eleanor nodded, making her way to the piano with a determination that Thomas had come to recognize as her way of pushing through anxiety. She settled on the bench, arranged her sheet music, and began to play. The piece was one Thomas had heard her practicing at home, a gentle, reflective composition that started simply but gradually revealed its complexity. As she played, other customers in the store stopped to listen. Herbert stood by the counter, a smile of wonder on his face. When she finished, the small audience applauded. Eleanor acknowledged them with a nod, her cheeks flushed with either embarrassment or pleasure, perhaps both. "You haven't lost your touch," Herbert said, his voice thick with emotion. "On the contrary," Eleanor replied. "I lost it for many years. I'm only now finding my way back." On the drive home, Eleanor was quiet, looking out the window at the passing scenery. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking about what comes next." Thomas glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Lily isn't my only student anymore," Eleanor said. "Herbert mentioned 2 more potential students while you were looking at those guitar books. And I've been recording some pieces at home, as you know." Thomas nodded. Eleanor had begun recording her playing on a small digital recorder he'd brought her, initially just as a way to track her progress as she regained her skills, but lately with greater purpose. "I'm thinking of hosting a small recital," she continued. "Nothing grand, just in my home, for my students and perhaps a few others. A way of coming full circle, I suppose." Thomas smiled, recognizing the significance of what she was suggesting. "I think that's a wonderful idea. You'll help me arrange it?" "Of course," Eleanor nodded, satisfied. Then, with characteristic directness, she added, "And afterward, I'd like to visit Richard at the cemetery. It's been too long, and I think I'm ready now." Thomas reached across and squeezed her hand briefly. "Whatever you need." 6 weeks later, on a perfect spring evening, Eleanor's Victorian home was filled with music and people. The sunroom had been rearranged to accommodate a small audience, just 12 people, seated on chairs borrowed from the dining room and a few neighbors' homes. Young Lily played first, her face serious with concentration as she performed a simple Mozart piece that Eleanor had taught her. Then Eleanor's 2 new students, a retired schoolteacher and a teenage boy with remarkable talent, took their turns at the Steinway. Finally, Eleanor herself rose from her seat beside Thomas and made her way to the piano. Her silver hair was arranged elegantly, and she wore a deep blue dress that Thomas had never seen before. "This final piece," she told the small gathering, "is one I performed at my first public recital, 67 years ago. It's also the piece I played for my late husband on the day I met him." She smiled, her eyes finding Thomas in the audience. "And it's the piece I played 4 months ago when a kind and persistent young man encouraged me to return to the instrument I had abandoned." She seated herself at the piano, took a breath, and began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune. The familiar melody filled the room, but this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty in her performance. Eleanor played with the confidence of someone who had found her way home after a long and difficult journey. Thomas watched her, remembering the bitter, isolated woman he had met last autumn. The transformation wasn't just in her playing, but in her entire being, the way she held herself, the way she engaged with the world around her, the light that had returned to her eyes. As the final notes of the piece resonated through the room, Eleanor looked up and met Thomas's gaze. In that moment of connection, he understood that he had been right on that December day. The piano had indeed been calling to her, waiting patiently for her return. And in finding her way back to music, Eleanor had found her way back to life itself. The applause that followed was enthusiastic but brief. Eleanor didn't need extended validation anymore. She had made peace with the critics of her past, both external and internal. What mattered now was the music, the sharing of her gift, and the joy of playing not for acclaim but for the pure love of it. Later, after the guests had gone and Thomas was helping Eleanor return the furniture to its usual arrangement, she paused by the piano, running her hand along its polished surface. "Richard would have loved this evening," she said softly. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "I think he would have." Eleanor nodded, a peaceful smile on her face. "Thank you, Thomas. Not just for today, but for seeing what I needed when I couldn't see it myself." Thomas shook his head. "The music was always within you, Eleanor. I just happened to be here when you were ready to find it again." "Nevertheless," she insisted, "some journeys are too difficult to make alone." As Thomas drove home that night, he reflected on the past 6 months and the unexpected friendship that had developed between himself and Eleanor Whitfield. What had begun as a challenging work assignment had become one of the most meaningful relationships of his life. The next day, they would visit Richard's grave together, another step in Eleanor's healing journey. And after that, there would be more music, more students, more moments of connection and growth. Some bells, it seemed, could be unrung after all. Some chances did come twice, and sometimes the most beautiful melodies were those that emerged after a long silence, played by hands that remembered more than their owner believed possible.